we're going to talk around strategic alignment today, and the case study, the user story that we've created. Before we delve into that story, let's have a little look at why we created this story and what we were trying to achieve. What was the problem that we were trying to solve? We do a lot of research every year, over 1,000 organizations. We've been doing it for a number of years. And what that research tells us is 91% of organizations have some form of strategy in place today to become a more agile, a more digital organization, and be able to really process and deliver change at a faster pace. However, when you look at the results, only 12% are saying they're achieving the results that they expect from all of those investments and efforts. And that really hasn't moved that much over the last couple of years. It's moved by 1% or 2% each year. And so if we were at school and this was a report card, I think we would be failing. And the reason is there's a big gap between the strategy and delivering results. And that gap is really the problem we wanted to solve, that the disconnection that exists between organizations that have the right intent in putting the strategy, but when it comes to the execution, maybe those things aren't as aligned as they should be. We did a lot of research into understanding why there was a gap and what were some of the common issues there. And we came out with these 5 key areas. One was around alignment, in the alignment not only between the strategy and the delivery, but also the alignment between all the different stakeholders who get involved in the process. And for that alignment to work, really, we need to start to have a common language, a common way of describing the business, so that when we talk around alignment and we talk around changes to the organization and the operations, we're talking the same language. And therefore, also how then we have greater transparency around that change, so people can start to see where the business is being impacted and when. The other 2 key areas that we identified through all of the research was really organizations struggling with being able to identify and focus on the value and the value areas in the organization that would drive most of the benefits, and also their ability to manage the complexity not only of their operations, but also the complexity of how they've really designed their transformation programs, and therefore how can you actually design out some of that complexity to give the teams a better chance of success. And so what we wanted to do is kind of create a story, a Sharp Cloud story, to solve this problem as a tool, which really helped join the dots, connect the strategy and the delivery, and start to give us some visibility and transparency to allow us to manage that gap and therefore close it. So that was really what we were looking to do. And the reason, I guess, Sharp Cloud, we picked Sharp Cloud in this case, was really because of its ability to manage relationships and show those relationships. So you can see here we've got a front screen. We've got some navigation items down the left. They're repeated on the first screen just so you can get some idea of what they're for. The top 2 really are where we spend most of our time around planning the activities and reviewing where we are. But the 3 at the bottom are quite key to setting up the story. The look at how we identify value, how we plan, and how we set up the models that underpin the story that we've got here. We'll start with the 2 so you can see the sort of activities that we're doing. And then once we've looked at those 2, we'll go and have a look at under the covers at what was needed really to set this up. So let's go and have a look at the activity view. And in terms of design, I guess, what we wanted to do is every time we clicked on one of these major screens here, we wanted the most impactful picture that we were going to use most of the time to be the first visualization that we saw. And so Here we're talking around managing the portfolio of work over a Kanban board that you would see, and you can see that the work is coming in terms of epics, big pieces of big chunks of work that are coming in and being reviewed and being analyzed and going onto our backlog. At some point in time, we want to take that work and move it into development and basically push the work down to the operational teams. And that's when we move the items, as you would do, into the green area, where we actually want to tell the system that we have here that we're now processing the operations and people are working on stuff. And then as it comes out at the back end, we don't just want to stop. We want to make sure that we continue to track those business outcomes until the point where we're happy with the outcome, or we decide that actually we're not going to get any more value out of it. So a traditional portfolio Kanban board, I think right at the front, nothing unusual about that. When we go in to look at the epics though, what we can start to see is the information that we've got behind these items. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but you can see here that this particular epic is linked to 2 business ambitions that this organization has as part of its strategy. It's impacting 2 what we call business imperatives, and business imperatives are things that you have to do well, the 40 or 45 things the organization has to do well to be successful. I'll explain a bit more about those as we move on. And also you can see already that there's a whole list of features, and we've just got some test data in here to show that there's some features that have been allocated already to that epic. So already we're going a step further than the traditional epic work. We've actually created a relationship with the epic, the ambitions that the organization has as a strategy, the areas of the business, those business imperatives that we're going to impact. And so we can now use a widget function, and we've got widgets in here, and you can see here already that we can now start to see the connections. So with widgets, if you don't know how to use these, effectively you're adding, and I'll show you here, you're adding a widget into the form, and you're picking up a bit of a URL here that you're pasting in, which effectively is from the widget story. And in this case, this widget story is all about mapping out these relationships. And I can zoom in and I can start to now look at this and see that actually I've got here this particular ambition, right, that the business has defined in dark blue. And you can see it's got some epics defined already. And you can see when we look at these epics that effectively they're starting to impact certain areas of the business. So in this case, we're going to have to do some great external communications as we dispose of that business. And that business effective, as we do that, that's obviously impacting our investor relations part of our business. You can see over here, as we start to transition the resources to the corporate, this is about looking at how we transfer assets. And you can see down here, we've got one over here where we're actually starting to validate the asset inventory. And this is really about thinking about our working capital management for the organization. So immediately, as we're starting to plan, you can see that there's a number of business areas that haven't been impacted yet in the plan. They're sitting there on their own. And you can see at the top, there's some other ambitions that have been defined. And some of those ambitions have some epics associated with them already as we start to plan out that work. So seeing connections is really, really important, right? Because that's where the complexity sits within the organization quite often. And it's the areas that we need to manage outside of individual teams. We also want to use a white wall because we're all having to work virtually today. And so as part of working virtually, we've had to digitize our white walls. And here we're using the feature here, which is if we look on the view, you'll see in here that we're using this thing called scrollable wall. And the scrollable wall feature on the wall allows us to move the wall around, as you can see. And also we can zoom in and zoom out of the wall. So we can treat it pretty much as a virtual white wall. We can start to add items on there, which can be ideas. we can start to still see the relationships. And if we go into any one of these particular items, we can start to drill down as you would do typically in Sharp Cloud and see the relationships between the data. So I can see Epic 1 is linked to those ambitions, is linked to those business imperatives, and has this whole list of features associated with it. So using the virtual wall is quite a nice facility in terms of being able to work remotely with other team members and start to put things on. And if you haven't used walls before, you have the ability to lasso items. You can right click, you can merge those items together to form one item. So you can take a number of ideas and merge them to become one feature, or you could actually group those features together if you wanted to, and merge them into whatever you want in terms of an epic or whatever. So you've got the merge feature, and I know that the Sharp Cloud team are working pretty busily on being able to make this a little bit easier to add items and add relationships. So we're looking forward to that development. In this case, we've also leveraging the Jira interface. So what happens for us is when we move the blue work, the epics, into the green zone, we're then actually extracting that data and passing it into Jira. So the operational teams effectively who are using Jira can now start working on those features and moving them up and down the Kanban board as they need to, as they complete that work. We don't want to interfere with the operations teams who already use tools like Jira for their operational control and development processes. What we want to do is pass the work down to them so they can get going, and we also want to be able to see where they are in terms of status. And so we pull back from that interface the features, and we can see the features against, in this case, a traditional Kanban board. Now we can again customize the Kanban board to suit. Best practice is always to design a Kanban board that suits yourself. And so here we can start to see the features and see what stages they're in. And of course, when the team updates in Jira and we extract that data, we'll see those items move across the Kanban board as the team works through them and gets them complete. Again, we can see connections. Again, here we're seeing the connections now of a different set of data. You can see here that we're seeing an epic, and we're seeing all the associated features that are associated with that epic. And also we're seeing here that that epic is associated with this ambition, and this ambition has another epic associated with it, and that epic has some features that need to be executed as well. And so being able to view the relationships at different levels as you progress through the work is very important. We also want to see the business impact, and so we use charts like this where we can actually start to see that depending upon where the features are planned, we can start to pull out and identify which of the business imperatives in our business model effectively are being impacted. And so we can see that from a time scale, we're impacting these 3 bits of the business in this period of time around June. But we've got a longer initiative that's impacting our whole bidding process that's going on longer. And that one is obviously driven by these 3 big features at the top, which are obviously taking longer to complete. So we also here starting to use this ability called related context. And in related context, we can start to pick which of those items are related to this thing called context, which we'll talk about later. So we can start to drill down and see how the plan changes related to the different contexts that we've defined in the story. Related records is quite a nice filter. If you've not used that before, it's in the filtering option. And when you go down here, you'll see at the bottom related items, and you can pick which of the categories of data you want to use to filter on where there's a relationship. So it's a great way of filtering out and seeing your relationships. So pretty much that's kind of the planning view, right, in terms of identifying and moving work around, seeing the status of that work and how it's impacting the release schedules, etc. We also have a facility here which is called review. And in review, we have a number of visualizations. The most important one is really, are we working on the right things? And so here you can see that there are specific business imperatives that have been identified, and the priority is in the vertical axis. So the fact that we have 3 green ones at the top is good, because those are high priority, and the amount of work that's being executed is across the horizontal. So it's good news in this case that you can see that we're working on 3 of the high priority items and work is being done, so we want to remain focused. Obviously, if we were working on lower priority items and maybe spending too much time doing too much work, we might want to question the investment. If we are not doing enough work on effectively the high priority items, we might want to increase our focus. And if we are not doing much work on the low priority ones, that's okay, but we just might want to monitor the situation and make sure that that is still okay. We want to see business imperatives. We provide a business model canvas view, so we can see again which business imperatives have been selected as part of the delivery and where they sit on a business model canvas, which helps us to explain where we're starting to impact the organization. We can also see accountability. So we now want to see who's accountable for which business operations. And here we're showing the priority in terms of color. So you can see that corporate has a number of green business imperatives it needs to focus on. So they're bright green. The red ones are less of a priority for them. We also want to be able to look at outcomes. And so we look at different types of value in terms of improving performance and improving service. And so here we want to see what the shape of the program looks like. And you can see that although we're touching most of the activity seems to be around improving performance. And that's not a bad thing, but one might want to question, why are we not doing more work around the customer or around new revenue streams? And so this is a great way to look to see if the program is balanced and focused on the right areas that you're looking to achieve. We get some shape to that in terms of starting to map out the shape, and then as we progress the program, we'll see our progress towards that. And we also can see shareholder value, and this is probably one of the interesting ones, going back to that value discussion. What we're doing here is the way we're looking at these business imperatives and the value enables us to reverse engineer back into a kind of shareholder value view, which shows us where the opportunity is against a kind of SVA chart that a finance director would love, and then actually see where the actual impact and progress of the program is going to be. And so very much starting to pull the enterprise value case together and be able to have a meaningful conversation around what this program is going to deliver in terms of value with the finance director. So that is sitting up there as well. So those are the two main views that we're using a lot. So let's go and see, how does this all get put together? So if we start with the setup, what you see here is we need to define a common framework, a common set of data that we're going to use in terms of our planning. And what we want to do is we want to be able to describe the value chain that the organization has, so we understand how the organization delivers value. And here you can see we're using forms on the right hand side, which make it easier for us to be able to enter and update the items on the diagram. And you can see we've got annotations to help people with how to read and how to interpret this particular page. We also want to be able to input these business imperatives that we talked about. These are the 40 or so things that we need to do well as an organization. And these are pretty much defined in a standard sharp cloud layout, but I can start to look at these and understand what they are. And this is about getting that common language that we talked about between the different stakeholders, a common way of describing the business. So when we talk about priorities, we can start to say, well, actually, this initiative is impacting these particular imperatives. And that starts to build a great framework and a better conversation because of that transparency. We also want to map the critical information and the quality of information. This is probably one of the areas most transformation programs underplay, is they don't really map out what is the key decision-making information the organization needs to make those decisions that unlock the value. And so we want to understand that information, and we want to understand its quality, because if the information quality is poor, it's going to make it difficult for us to actually provide solutions and address those areas and therefore make the right decisions. So a kind of information focused lens is really important. We also want to map the strategy. And so here we're capturing the ambition that the organization has, normally the output of its strategic planning process, but we want to do it in a structured way. So we're doing a positive inquiry where we want to start to map out what could great look like, what makes, how is this happening, right? So we really want to start to answer some key questions that help us get a better understanding of the ambition. And this is where we start to then say, well, to achieve this ambition, please tell me which of the business imperatives you need to improve to be able to meet this ambition. So we're now creating that relationship between the ambition and the business imperatives. And that's important in terms of building up this framework. And we also obviously want to define the owners that we're going to put in. And here we're also starting to define the OKRs for the different owners as well, so we can start to understand where the key objectives are within the organization. It's quite a lot of data to set up. And as you can see, just by this model, and we haven't modeled a lot of data yet in this example, you can see there's a lot of relationships are there. And you might be asking, well, what does that tell us? And this is where we're using this ability called context. And context can be used in many ways. It can be used to just mirror your ambitions. It might be used to define strategies for different products. It might be used to define different value streams that you want to actually work on within your organization. But it's really a grouping. But once we define a grouping, we can then easily see that in this case, disposing of Greyhound, which is a bus company, I believe, in the US, right, is linked to this context called business carve out, and it's really impacting three business areas, three business imperatives that we're interested in. If I go and have a look at contract management is something we want to drive within North America, and you can see there's a number of business imperatives that are impacted here. So setting up the framework and creating the relationships is critical for us to then be able to analyze how we're adding value and which parts of the organization we're adding value to. And this is all kind of done in this setup process. It's normally a one-off thing that you do at the beginning or every time you want to adjust your strategy, set new ambitions, etc. Once the setup's done and the relationships are done, that's what's enabling all of the reporting to happen at the top. The second thing that we need to do is set up the planning view. And so the planning view is again, looking at a Gantt view, is defining the PIs and the increments in terms of how you're planning to deliver your program. And so this is where you would identify your iterations and place your iterations into a time plan, so that you can visualize and see where that activity is happening. And of course, if we go into any one of these, I can already see, look, that this iteration has already got some features that have been allocated to it. And if I was to go into some of those features, I can immediately see that that feature is part of this epic. And if I go into that epic, I can see actually there's some other features that are part of this epic. I can see the ambitions and I can see the business imperatives. So now you're starting to see the power of effectively those relationships that we created in setup, and the ability now to interpret our plan and say, well, if we're going in here and we're starting to address these features, are there any others that we should be grouping in as part of this iteration? Do we want to think about that and maybe include them in this part of the plan? And again, here you can very easily create PIs and create iterations. The third piece of setup really is this thing around value. And this is where we're actually starting to take those business imperatives. Remember, these are the items that we need to be successful with. But they're also the items that we jointly described and named with the business and the stakeholders, so everybody understands what these are, and we can start to have a conversation in terms of their value contribution. And we do that by looking at the potential value they can add and moving that to the right or to the left, and also the probability and the ease of actually achieving that value. And as we move those around, the colors would change. And so you'll see that the overall priorities change associated with those. And what's interesting with this is we're using, as you would do, calculated fields. So if you've not used calculated fields before in the items, we use calculated fields quite a lot in terms of calculating all of the value and the items here. And you can go in and pick these and see how we're calculating those items. So this value conversation is a great way of sitting on a screen with a bunch of stakeholders and starting to have a discussion around this. We do have views of this where we use voting systems as well to actually get group voting on the priority of items. And if you've not seen those widgets, there are some nice widgets that you can now use and embed into your item that enables you to cast out a vote for the people using the image to or link or to the code to be able to vote on a particular item and you to see the results and use those results then to define where the item is. And that's great when you have a number of stakeholders in the room that have got different opinions and you want to try and see if you can get convergence around those. So I think those are the three setup items. So I'll go back to the start and we'll say what we've got is a very activity driven portfolio plan, one which is linked to the strategy through the ambitions, through the business imperatives, the critical information. So we can see whether it be at a feature level or an epic level, which parts of the organization we're impacting. And we have a way to actually see how, when we work on those items, how they contribute to the overall value within the organization, and therefore making that link between delivery and strategy value. So I'll stop and see if there's any questions. Let's start here with, this is quite a nice little story we've developed. First of all, maturity assessments typically are questionnaires that get sent out. People get the questionnaire, they fill in the answers, and then you give them some sort of rating on the maturity scale. And so the first part of what we wanted to do is be able to mimic that situation. So here we've built a story where you can go in, you enter some data here about who the company is and some instructions, and you can see here that we've got all of our questions around maturity. In fact, for our maturity assessment, if I can scroll down very quickly, I've got, so I'm trying to scroll down, it doesn't want to scroll down. There's 190 of them anyway. So there's 190 questions, or 178 it says here, sorry, questions that we've defined. You can change those questions in this form. So, this just happens to be the set of questions we're asking from all of our research. What we then did is you've got an ability to view that. So we're using a feature here where that's pulled together and it's actually putting that into an actual questionnaire. And you can see the desktop and mobile version. And then I can go in and get the link and I can now send that questionnaire to people and they would effectively see something that looked like this. And they could go in and they could start to complete the questionnaire. Okay, so that's the questionnaire part of it, which would be a traditional kind of maturity assessment. And now we've built this story. This is kind of almost, we can ask any questions and send them out to anybody. We can create multiple questionnaires. So we've built ourselves a little questionnaire engine, if you want to think of it that way. What we then do, though, is that would be a traditional way of doing it. Let me see if this is the right one. No, that's not the right one. So let me go to the other one, sorry. And then I'll go to that one. So what happens is I'm always picking the wrong one. Sorry. I need to. There you go. So, what we tend to do, because nobody wants to answer 190 questions, is we tend to take a subset of questions. So, let's say the client is interested in customer centricity. We take the questions that are associated with customer centricity and we send those out to the group of people who are going to attend the event. So typically you can see in this case, it's 21 questions. They fill those questions in. The data comes back. What we then do though, is we then open up a virtual event. And in the virtual event, what we can see is the answers to these questions that they've completed in their survey. But we want to explore that. So let's say we're going into delightful products. We will talk about the scores and the range and people's views. And we will have a conversation around this concept that our products and services delight our customers. And once we've had a conversation and listened to the opinions of the group, we'll use the voting widget that you can see here, and people will scan the code or link on the vote. Up will pop the question. I will answer the question. Everybody will answer the question. And effectively, we go back into the vote and I look at the results. And what we can start to see is actually how people voted, having had a discussion about that particular question. So we started to be more transparent. We started to listen to each other's points of view, and we started to understand the topic in a little bit more context maybe than we have done before from different people's perspectives. And so we go through answering those questions. What we can then start to look at is we can start to see how the results changed from the original pre-survey results. So we can see what people initially thought, and then after coming together and listening to each other, what they now think. And then once we've had a discussion around that, we can have a discussion around effectively how that compares with the benchmarks that we have. So this is what we call the fishbowl event, where we're now actually facilitating a virtual meeting around this. Where this all ends up, though, which is really the powerful piece of this, if I go into the actual reporting part, which we then do, is effectively we start to look at actually how the organization scores. So we take that data in and we start to look at how that organization scored itself in terms of the three areas. And we look across three dimensions. We look at the direction setting dimension, the operating model, and the execution. And we can take each of those and we can have a look at those, and we can start to understand actually how the organization's maturity is scoring. And that's quite interesting. And I'd say that that's pretty traditional to most maturity models. What we've done, though, is we've identified effectively that there are threads, there are connections between certain questions, and that we call these golden threads. Remember, we talked about one of those threads being around customer centricity. And so when you look at an organization, it's a lot more complicated than people think. And so if you want to go and have a look at, say, agile practices and governance, what we start to look at now is those two kind of areas, which are the bits around the outside, which are now colored in depending upon how the scoring was. And you can start to see where the items that connect those two areas together. And so we can start to say, well, actually, if you want to get an agile mindset, but also you want to sort the governance out, then there's some things here that you need to actually put in place, right? Like lean budget guide rails are established and dynamically updated. So the maturity is going a lot further into not just an assessment, but actually understanding the connections. And the reason this is important is because what we've started to see was organizations would quite often make a change. Let's say they wanted to drive innovation and they wanted to put innovation labs in place. They would do that. And then after about 18 months, everybody would be saying, we don't really see the value. We're going to stop the funding. And that was because they didn't make the changes in the actual organization that was receiving that innovation to be able to implement it. And so it's really important to manage those connections. So the whole maturity is looking at the ability to score your organization, do it in a collaborative way, look at these dimensions, look at the golden threads and the connectivities, and then start to decide what your next best action is. And this is really starting to help identify what your change leadership plan should be within the organization. So that's quite an interesting story, and one that really is very hot for us at the moment in terms of organizations, because everybody wants to be an agile organization. Everybody wants to move at pace and process change faster. But the next question is, what does that look like? And what do I need to change? And this is where something like this can help.